There are loves that come with advance notice. They give you time to prepare, to fix your hair, to put your best self on display. But then there are others, the most dangerous ones, the most real ones, that catch you completely off guard, that rip you from the ground without asking permission, throw you into free fall, and when you finally land, you no longer know who you were before. You only know there's no going back. And here's the truth nobody tells you. The loves that destroy you are the same ones that rebuild you. The ones that scare you are the ones that teach you what real courage is. And the ones that shouldn't exist, those are the ones you never forget. Because forbidden love isn't about romance. It's not about flowers, candlelit dinners, or perfect declarations rehearsed in front of the mirror. Forbidden love is about choice. It's about looking at everything you have to lose. Your life, your safety, your very identity, and still not being able to let go of the hand of the person beside you. It's about discovering that there are things more important than surviving. There are things worth risking everything for. And when you finally understand that, when you finally stop calculating risks and start truly feeling, that's when you discover who you really are. Not who they taught you to be, not who you pretend to be, but who you are when all the masks fall and only the essential remains. And if you've lived this, if you've felt your heart beat out of rhythm for someone logic told you to avoid, if you've extended your hand knowing you could get burned, if you've loved against all the rules and still don't regret it, then you know what I'm talking about. You know there are loves that don't ask permission, that don't follow a calendar, that don't respect borders, literal or metaphorical. They simply happen, like an accident, like a collision, like a whirlwind that rips you from the sky and throws you exactly where you needed to be, even if you didn't know it. And this story you're about to hear is about that. About two people who had nothing in common, who came from opposite sides of a line that should never be crossed, who met by accident and discovered that sometimes the universe makes mistakes on purpose just to put you on the right path. It's about Lena, a woman who spent her entire life trying to prove her worth and discovered that true worth doesn't come from achievements, but from courage. And about Aaron, a man who lived within rules so rigid he had forgotten what it meant to feel, until an unexpected collision forced him to remember that existing isn't the same as being alive. It's a story about fear and courage, about safety and freedom, about the impossible choice between protecting what you have and risking everything for what you could have. And if you're here looking for easy answers, neatly wrapped endings, guarantees that love always wins, this isn't that story. This is a story about love that rips you from the ground, that shakes you, that forces you to decide between truly living or just surviving. And the ending doesn't matter, because what really matters is the courage to have tried. So if you like stories that make you feel, that mess you up, that remind you what it's like to be truly alive, that touch that place deep in your chest that you try to protect but secretly want to be reached, stay with me. Because this story will take you to a place where borders don't exist, where rules don't matter, and where the only map that works is the one of the heart. And when it's over, you'll understand why some loves, even the most unlikely ones, the most dangerous ones, the most forbidden ones, are the only ones worth it. Because they don't leave you whole, but they leave you true. And if this story touches something in you, if it awakens a memory, ignites a hope, or simply makes you feel less alone in the impossible choices life sometimes forces you to make, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because here at Ctrl plus Love, every story is a reminder that love still exists, in the most unexpected forms, in the most unlikely places, and in the collisions we never asked for. But that changed everything. Imagine being ripped from your own life and thrown, without warning, into the arms of someone you shouldn't love, not by choice, not by chance, but by a collision so violent that the universe seemed to forget its own rules for an instant. That's the kind of encounter I'm talking about today, the kind that comes like a whirlwind, rips you from the ground, and leaves you suspended between fear and something you can't even name yet. something that pulses, something that burns, something that shouldn't exist, but does. It wasn't a planned encounter. It was a collision, almost as if the universe had slipped and let two realities crash into each other. You know that feeling when you're driving calmly, thinking about life, and suddenly a car comes in the opposite direction? You brake, your heart races, the world stops, and even after everything returns to normal, you still taste the shock in your mouth. It was like that. Except there was no break. There was no return to normal. The crash happened, and what came after changed everything. Because there are encounters that don't let you go back to who you were before. They redraw you from the inside. And if you like stories like this, the ones that grip you, mess you up, and make you truly feel, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. That really helps Ctrl plus Love grow and bring more stories that touch where it hurts and where it heals. Because there's a kind of love that only exists when life pushes you out of the safe zone. And this story is about exactly that. Lena Juan always carried the weight of being someone important's daughter. Not the kind of importance that comes with affection or quiet pride, but the kind that comes with demands, with measuring looks, with expectations that are never spoken aloud but are always there, like an invisible presence in the room. She grew up trying to prove something, to her father, to the family company, to herself perhaps. You know when you feel like you're always chasing approval that never comes? When every achievement never seems enough because they're already expecting the next one before you even breathe? That was Lena's life. And she was tired. So on that morning of clear sky and favorable wind, she decided to test one of the family company's new free flight equipment. Not because she had to. Not because someone asked. But because for a moment, she wanted to feel what it was like to be suspended in the air without the weight of anything. Without a surname, without pressure, without the feeling of always owing something to someone. She wanted peace. That's all. A piece of sky that was hers alone. And for a few minutes, as she glided over the mountains, she had exactly that. The silence of the wind, the lightness of belonging nowhere, the illusion that up there, the rules of the ground didn't matter. But then came the whirlwind, without warning, without mercy, like a giant hand that ripped her from the air and threw her far away, far from the plan, far from safety, far from everything she knew. The equipment spun, the sky became ground, and when she finally fell, it wasn't in familiar territory. It was on the other side, the forbidden side, the side where no one should be. It's like when you do everything right. Follow the map, take care, plan every step. And still life pushes you to a place you never imagined stepping. And there's no going back. There's no undoing it. You can only deal with what comes next. And it was exactly there, in that silent and dangerous territory, that she met Aaron Joe. He wasn't waiting for her. He wasn't waiting for anything, actually. Aaron was the kind of man who lived within straight lines. Routine, discipline, obedience. An officer trained to never question, never hesitate, never deviate from the path. He knew the rules, followed the rules. And the rules said that someone like Lena, coming from where she came from, was a threat, a problem. Something that should be reported immediately. But when he saw her there, unconscious among the equipment wreckage, her face still marked by the impact and her hair undone by the wind, something in him hesitated. Something in him stopped. And in that hesitation, brief, almost imperceptible, everything began. When Lena opened her eyes, the first thing she felt was pain. Not the sharp pain of a broken bone, the kind that screams and demands immediate attention, but that dull, deep pain that takes over your entire body like a slow, relentless wave. It was as if every muscle had been twisted, every nerve stretched beyond its limit. Every fiber of her body remembered that she had just fallen from the sky. She blinked slowly, trying to focus her vision, and the world around her began to take shape. The sky above her was too blue, too clear, almost unreal. That kind of blue you see in edited photos but never seems to actually exist. And then she saw the face. A masculine face, serious, angular, watching her from above with a strange mix of caution and something she couldn't immediately decipher. Fear? Curiosity? Maybe both. Maybe something beyond that. She tried to get up, but her body didn't obey. Her arms felt like lead, her legs distant, as if they belonged to someone else. And it was then, in that moment of absolute fragility, that fear began to rise. Not a loud fear, but that silent fear that paralyzes you from within. Because she realized she was no longer where she should be. The smell of the air was different, denser, loaded with humidity and wet earth. The silence was different. It wasn't the absence of sound, but a kind of heavy quietness, as if the environment itself was holding its breath. Even the light seemed to have a different texture, a different weight, a different temperature. And that man, standing there, his eyes fixed on her, didn't seem like someone who was there to help. He seemed like someone who was there to decide. The sensation was like waking up after an intense dream. That kind of dream that seems too real to be a lie and too false to be real. You wake up confused, disoriented, trying to separate what was lived from what was invented by your own head. Except Lena wasn't dreaming. The pain was real. The hard ground beneath her was real. The man in front of her, with that impenetrable expression, was real. And the fear that was beginning to take hold of her was also real. You know when you wake up in a strange place? A hotel, someone's house, a hospital room, and for a few seconds you don't know where you are? That feeling of total displacement, of not belonging, of being out of your own axis? It was that, only multiplied by 1,000, because she wasn't just in a strange place. She was in a forbidden place. She tried to speak, but her voice came out weak, hoarse, almost a whisper. Where am I? The words came out dragged, as if her tongue itself was heavy. Aaron didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking at her, motionless, as if he were calculating each word before saying it, weighing each syllable, measuring each consequence. The silence between them stretched. An uncomfortable silence, loaded with tension, the kind that makes you feel each second pass. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but carried a weight she didn't expect. You shouldn't be here. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. Cold, simple, true. And he knew that better than anyone. He knew that woman, fallen there like a wounded bird, was a time bomb. He knew that every second she spent there, alive and conscious, was one more second of risk. For her, for him, for everything he had built so carefully over the years. Reporting her was the only right thing to do. It was protocol. It was the law. It was what he had been trained to do from day one, without questioning, without hesitating, without leaving room for doubt. He knew the rules by heart, had memorized every line, every comma, every exception. And there was no exception for this. There was no loophole. There was no margin for interpretation. Someone from the other side who crossed the border was a threat. Period. But as he looked at her, at the way she was trying to control her fear, at the way her hands trembled as they touched her own face, searching for injuries, at the glint of vulnerability in her eyes, something in him locked up. Something deep. Something he didn't even know still existed inside him, refused to obey. It's like when you're about to do something you know you should do, but something inside you screams, "No, not yet, wait." That internal voice that sometimes appears at the most inconvenient moments and makes you hesitate precisely when you can't afford to hesitate. Aaron felt that, and he hated feeling it. He looked at the radio attached to his belt. All he had to do was grab it, press the button, say the right words, and everything would be resolved. He would have done what he should. He would have fulfilled his duty. He would have protected himself and the order he swore to defend. But his hands didn't move. His fingers didn't reach for the radio. And the more he looked at her, the harder it became to imagine making that call. Because she didn't look like a threat. She looked lost, hurt, human. And maybe that's what disarmed him. Her humanity, her fragility, the way she was there, completely at his mercy, without weapons, without defenses, without anything but her own fear. And it was in that moment, in that minimal pause between duty and humanity, between what he should do and what he wanted to do, that Aaron made the decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to report her, not yet. Maybe never. He was going to hide her. He was going to risk everything, his career, his safety, maybe even his life, for a woman he didn't even know. And he didn't even know why. Couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it. He just knew that something in him, something stronger than logic, stronger than training, stronger than fear, had decided for him. And when he extended his hand to help her up, he knew there was no going back. The collision had happened, and now he was falling too. Aaron Joe had never disobeyed an order in his life. Not because he was a coward, but because he believed, or at least had believed until that moment, that structure existed for a reason. That rules weren't just arbitrary lines drawn on the ground, but foundations that kept everything standing. He grew up hearing that real men don't question, they just comply. That doubt was weakness. That hesitation was the first step toward chaos. And he had internalized all of that, had molded his entire life around these certainties. He woke up at the same time every day, followed the same routine, did the same patrols, reported everything he saw, everything he heard, everything that seemed even minimally out of place. He was reliable, predictable, safe. And that was exactly why he had survived so long in a place where a single mistake could cost everything. But now, looking at Lena, at that woman who could barely stand, who trembled not just from pain but from fear, who looked around as if trying to understand how she had ended up there, Aaron found himself facing a choice he never imagined having to make. And the worst part was that there was no right choice. Whichever path he took, someone would get hurt. If he reported her, she would be taken, interrogated, possibly imprisoned or worse. If he hid her, he would become an accomplice to something that, in the eyes of the law, was treason. And treason had no forgiveness, no mitigating circumstances, no second chance. It was the end of his career, the end of life as he knew it, the end of everything he had built with so much discipline over the years. But while these thoughts stumbled over each other in his head, something deeper, more visceral, screamed louder. You know when you see someone at the edge of an abyss, and you can only extend your hand, before even thinking about the consequences, before calculating the risks, before asking if that person deserves to be saved. It's an impulse, an instinct, something that comes from a place that logic can't reach. And that was exactly what Aaron felt. It wasn't a rational decision. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't planned. It was almost animal. It was the feeling that if he didn't do something in that moment, he would never be able to look at himself in the mirror again without feeling disgusted with himself. He had seen people be taken away before, had seen what happened to those who crossed the border without permission, had heard the muffled screams, seen families being separated, witnessed the way people disappeared without a trace. And he had always done what he was told, always followed protocol, always repeated to himself that it wasn't his responsibility to question, just to obey. But this time, for the first time in his life, something inside him refused to repeat that formula. Something inside him said, "Not this time, not with her." And he didn't even know why. It didn't make sense. She was a stranger, an intruder, someone who technically represented everything he should fight against. But when he looked at her, he didn't see an enemy. He saw only a scared person who needed help. So he did the unthinkable. He extended his hand, helped her up, and said in a low voice, almost a whisper, "You need to come with me. Now. And you can't make noise." Lena looked at him with distrust, and he didn't blame her for it. Why would she trust him? She didn't know who he was, didn't know if he was trying to help her or just taking her somewhere worse. But she also had no choice. She was hurt, disoriented, completely lost in hostile territory. And that man, however serious and intimidating he seemed, was the only thing between her and complete unknown. So she accepted his hand. And in that touch, in that brief contact of skin with skin, something passed between them. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Like a weak electrical current, but constant. Aaron took her to a place he knew well. A small abandoned structure on the outskirts of the patrol zone. A space he sometimes used when he needed a moment of silence, away from the constant stares, away from the pressure of always being alert. It was little more than 4 walls and a roof, with a broken window and the smell of old wood and dampness. But it was safe, at least for now. He helped her sit on the floor, leaning against the wall, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. The silence was heavy, loaded with everything that wasn't being said. She looked at him, trying to decipher him. He looked at the floor, trying to understand what the hell he had just done. And then she spoke, her voice still weak, but firmer than before. "Why are you helping me?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Aaron took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face, and finally looked at her. "I don't know," he responded, and it was the most honest truth he had said in years. "I really don't know." And maybe that was exactly what made everything even more dangerous. Because when you make a decision for a clear reason, you can justify it, defend it, find logic in it. But when you do something without knowing why, when you act against everything you believe just because something inside you forces you to, you lose control. And Aaron, for the first time in his life, was completely out of control. I've lived this. Not in these exact circumstances, of course. I never hid someone who crossed a forbidden border. But I found myself in situations where helping someone went against everything I was taught to do. I've extended my hand when everyone around me said not to. I've chosen hard over head and paid the price for it. And what I learned is that there are decisions that don't need to make sense at the time. They just need to be right. And sometimes you only discover if they were right much later, when you look back and realize that that moment, that single moment of courage or madness or compassion, changed everything. For you. For the other person. For the direction life took from there. And that was exactly what was happening in that small, abandoned structure, with Lena sitting on the floor trying to process everything, and Aaron leaning against the opposite wall, still holding the radio on his belt, still feeling the weight of the choice he had just made. Neither of them knew what would come next. Neither of them had a plan. All they knew was that, from that moment on, they were connected. Not by choice, not by destiny, but by an accidental collision that had thrown them into each other's arms. And now, all that remained was to discover if they could survive the impact. The first few days were strange. Not just strange, they were uncomfortable, tense, full of silences that lasted too long and glances that lasted less than they should. Lena and Aaron were trapped in that small space, sharing the same air, the same fear, but living in completely different worlds inside their own heads. She came from a place where everything was speed, opinion, constant movement, where people spoke loudly, argued, laughed, fought, made noise just because, where you could question, challenge, change your mind 3 times in the same day, and no one judged you for it. Lena had grown up in a family where chaos was the norm. Meetings that turned into heated debates, dinners that ended with doors slamming, love expressed through screams and tight hugs. She was made of intensity, of impulse, of emotion at the surface. Aaron, on the other hand, was made of silence, of restraint, of a discipline so deep it had become part of his bone structure. He came from a place where talking too much could put you in danger, where expressing an opinion was a luxury few could afford, where every gesture was calculated, every word weighed before leaving the mouth. He had learned early that survival depended on control of emotions, control of reactions, control even of one's own thoughts. He woke up at the same time every day, not because he liked it, but because routine was safety. He ate the same things, followed the same paths, kept everything predictable because predictability meant nothing could catch you by surprise. And surprises, in his world, were always bad. So when Lena started asking questions, and she asked many questions, Aaron didn't know how to deal with it. Why do you live like this? Why don't you question anything? How do you stand this silence all the time? She spoke with her hands, gestured, occupied space even in a tiny room. And him? He shrank. Not physically, but internally. Each of her questions seemed like an invasion, a challenge to the order he had built with so much effort. He answered with monosyllables, with silences, with looks that said, "Let it go." But she didn't let it go. She kept poking, testing, trying to understand, and it irritated him. But it also fascinated him, because he had never met anyone so alive, so present, so incapable of staying quiet. And Lena, for her part, didn't understand how someone could be so contained, so closed off, so impermeable. She tried to start conversations, and he responded with a sentence. She made a joke, and he just nodded, without smiling. She vented about fear, about missing home, about the uncertainty of what would come next, and he just listened, without offering comfort, without saying everything would be okay. At first, she thought he was cold, insensitive, maybe even cruel in a silent way, but over time, she began to realize it wasn't that. He wasn't cold. He was careful. He wasn't insensitive. He was protected. He had built walls so high around himself that even he no longer knew how to tear them down. And she, without realizing it, was beginning to climb them. It was like trying to fit two puzzle pieces that don't belong to the same box, but that mysteriously adjust. You know when you meet someone so different from you that it seems impossible to have any connection. And yet, somehow inexplicably, you understand each other? Not through words, but through silences. Not through what you say, but through what you feel. It's strange. It's uncomfortable. But it's also real. And that's what started happening between them. Lena learned to respect his silences, and Aaron learned to tolerate her questions. She stopped pushing. He started answering with more than monosyllables. And little by little, without either of them noticing, they began to adjust. There's a moment in my life that reminds me a lot of this. I had a friend, someone completely opposite to me. I was loud, he was quiet. I talked too much. He chose each word as if it were gold. And at first, we clashed all the time. I thought he was boring. He thought I was invasive. But we were forced to coexist, work, circumstances, whatever. And over time, something changed. I began to understand that his silence wasn't empty. It was full of thoughts, of observations, of a depth I had never stopped to notice. And he began to understand that my noise wasn't superficiality. It was the way I processed the world. And when we finally stopped trying to change each other and just started existing together, we discovered a connection that neither of us expected. He taught me to listen. I taught him to speak. And in the end, we became better because of it. And that was exactly what was happening with Lena and Aaron. She was learning to read his silences, to realize that when he looked away, it wasn't indifference, it was discomfort. That when he stayed quiet for too long, it wasn't because he had nothing to say, but because he was trying to find the right words. That when he brought water to her without her asking, it wasn't just mechanical kindness, it was care, it was attention. It was his way of saying, "I see you," without needing to use words. And Aaron, for his part, was learning that her intensity wasn't invasion. It was life. It was the way she refused to disappear, to become invisible, to accept silence as destiny. She reminded him that there was a world beyond rules, beyond fear, beyond calculated survival. And then the small gestures began. He brought tea for her one night, when he noticed she was shivering from cold. She shared the only chocolate bar she had kept in her backpack. He fixed the broken window so the rain wouldn't come in. She folded his jacket that was thrown on the floor and placed it near the door, the way he always left it. Neither of them said anything about these gestures. Neither of them acknowledged out loud what was happening. But both felt it. Felt that something was changing. That the space between them was getting smaller. That the discomfort was being replaced by something softer, warmer, more dangerous. Because there's a kind of connection that doesn't ask permission. That doesn't knock on the door. That doesn't wait for the right moment. It just happens. Slowly. Silently. Almost invisibly. Until one day you wake up and realize that that person you barely knew, who irritated you, who seemed the opposite of everything you were, has become indispensable. And you don't even know when it happened. Can't point to the exact moment. You just know it happened. And that now, the idea of being without them hurts in a way you didn't expect, in a way you don't know how to deal with, in a way that changes everything. And that was exactly what happened in that small abandoned structure, where two people from opposite worlds began to build, without wanting to, a new world. A world made of shared tea and comfortable silences, of small gestures that said more than 1,000 words, of an involuntary connection that neither of them asked for, but that both, secretly, began to need. And the scariest part of all was that they knew, both knew, that the closer they got, the greater the risk, the greater the fall, the greater the pain when everything collapsed. Because things like this, so fragile, so unlikely, rarely survive the real world. But even knowing this, neither of them could stop. Neither of them wanted to stop. Because sometimes you find something so rare, so true, that it's worth risking everything, even knowing you might lose. The first time Lena made Aaron smile was completely unintentional. She was trying to cook something with the limited ingredients he had. Basically rice, some wilted vegetables, and a seasoning she didn't even know what it was. She had never been good in the kitchen. Actually, she was terrible. At home, there was always someone cooking for her. And when she lived alone, she survived on delivery and ready-made meals. But there, in that place forgotten by the world, there was no delivery. There was no microwave. There was nothing but her, an old pot, and the determination not to die of hunger. So she tried. And the result was questionable. When she served the plate to Aaron, he looked at the food with an expression she couldn't decipher. Was it horror? Was it confusion? Was it genuine fear? He picked up the fork slowly, as if he were disarming a bomb, brought it to his mouth, chewed once, twice, and stopped. Lena held her breath. So? Is it good? He didn't respond immediately, just kept chewing, with that serious face as always. And then, for the first time since they met, he let out a laugh. It wasn't a belly laugh. It was more of a muffled laugh, almost an amused sigh. But it was real. And Lena was so surprised that she dropped her own fork. Did you just laugh? He tried to disguise it, returning to his neutral expression. No. You laughed. I saw it. You must have imagined it. but the smile still played at the corner of his mouth, and Lena felt something ignite in her chest, a mixture of victory, of silly pride, of genuine joy for having managed to extract a human reaction from that man of stone. She didn't care that the food was horrible, didn't care that he was clearly just being polite by eating. What mattered was that she had seen him smile, and now that she knew he was capable of it, she was going to do everything to see it again. From that day on, Lena began to test his limits. Not in a cruel or invasive way, but in a light, playful way. She made absurd comments just to see if he reacted, told exaggerated stories from her life just to see that muscle at the corner of his mouth tremble, as if he were fighting against a smile. One night, she was trying to imitate the way he walked, all rigid, with his back straight, as if he were always at attention. She marched around the small room with exaggerated seriousness, and when she turned to look at him, expecting a reaction, she found Aaron with his hand covering his mouth, his shoulders shaking with contained laughter. "I don't walk like that," he murmured, but his voice was lighter than normal. "You walk exactly like that," Lena insisted, doing the imitation again. "It looks like you have a ruler glued to your back." This time, he couldn't hold it. He laughed for real. A low laugh, almost hoarse, as if it were rusty from so much time without use. And in that laugh, Lena saw something that caught her by surprise: vulnerability, humanity. Proof that underneath all that armor, there was someone real. And from there, something changed. Not drastically, not overnight, but gradually, like ice melting under the weak winter sun. Aaron began to talk more. Not much. He was still a man of few words. But now, when he spoke, the words came accompanied by looks, by half-smiles, by a presence that wasn't there before. He talked about his childhood, about how he had learned to stay quiet because noise attracted attention, and attention was never a good thing. About how he had learned not to question, because questioning was dangerous. About how he had built an entire life around not feeling too much, not wanting too much, not expecting too much. And Lena listened, really listened, without interrupting, without judging, just present. And then, one night, it was her turn. She talked about the pressure she felt at home, about how she had never been good enough for her father, no matter how hard she tried. About how she had grown up believing that love was something you needed to deserve, to earn, to constantly prove. About how she had spent her entire life chasing approval that never came. And when she finished talking, with her voice catching and her eyes shining with tears that refused to fall, Aaron did something unexpected. He moved closer, not much, just enough for her to feel his presence, and said quietly, "You don't need to prove anything to anyone." It wasn't a motivational speech. It wasn't an attempt to solve her problems with pretty words. It was just his truth, said in the simplest way possible. And somehow, that was more comforting than anything elaborate could have been. And that's when gestures began to speak louder than words. He started making tea for her every morning, the way she liked it. Warm, not hot, because she always complained it burned her tongue. She started folding his clothes, because she noticed he hated when things were messy, even if he never said anything. He fixed the strap of her backpack that had broken in the fall. She sewed a button on his jacket that was about to fall off. They were small things, insignificant to anyone on the outside. But for them, they were immense. They were ways of saying, "I see you," without needing to speak. They were ways of caring without making care something uncomfortable or heavy. You know that moment when you realize you're paying attention to silly details about someone? Like the way the person holds a cup, or the sound they make when they're thinking, or the way they breathe when they're about to fall asleep. You didn't decide to pay attention. It just happened. And when you realize it, you've already memorized a bunch of things about that person. Things no one else in the world knows, because no one else paid attention. And then you realize you're screwed. Because when you start memorizing someone like that, without wanting to, without asking, it's because that person has already entered a place inside you that has no exit door. And that's what happened with them. Lena knew exactly how many seconds Aaron took to wake up after she moved in the morning. Always 8 seconds, as if he were checking internally if everything was okay before opening his eyes. Aaron knew that she always tied her hair 3 times before being satisfied with the result. Lena knew that he never drank the last drop of water, always left a little at the bottom of the glass. Aaron knew that she bit her lower lip when she was nervous, and neither of them had decided to pay attention to these things. They had just been recorded silently, in the back of each other's memory. As if the brain were archiving important information, even without permission. And then came the night when everything truly changed. It wasn't anything dramatic. There was no passionate confession. There was no cinematic kiss. It was just proximity. They were sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, sharing a thin blanket because the night was freezing. Lena was talking about something. She didn't even remember what anymore. And in the middle of the sentence, she realized that Aaron was looking at her. Not in a distracted way, not in a polite way, but intensely, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. And when she stopped talking, the silence that settled wasn't uncomfortable. It was loaded, heavy, the kind that makes your heart race and your breathing become irregular. "What?" she asked, her voice lower than intended. Aaron didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking, and Lena saw something pass through his eyes, something she couldn't name, but that she instantly recognized, because she felt the same thing. That strange mixture of fear and desire, of wanting and resistance, of wanting to get closer and wanting to run away at the same time. "Nothing," he said finally, but his voice came out hoarse. "It's just that you talk too much." She should have been offended, should have retorted, but instead she smiled. Because she knew, they both knew, that wasn't what he was thinking. And when she rested her head on his shoulder, without asking permission, without explaining, just doing it because it felt right, he didn't pull away, didn't get tense, didn't complain. He just stayed there, motionless, as if any movement could break that fragile and unlikely moment. And it was there, in that simple and so human gesture, that they crossed an invisible line. The line between strangers and accomplices, between forced coexistence and conscious choice, between tolerance and care. And the scariest part of all was that neither of them knew how to go back. Neither of them was sure if they wanted to go back. Because the kind of feeling that arrives without knocking on the door, without asking permission, without waiting for the right moment, is also the kind that can't be ignored. It keeps growing, slowly, deep in your chest, until it occupies every empty space you had, until you can no longer imagine what life was like before it, until you realize that somehow absurd and unexpected, that person has become essential, and that now you're irremediably, terribly, wonderfully screwed. But reality never let them forget where they were. As much as that small, isolated space was beginning to feel like a refuge, as much as the days were gaining a strangely comfortable routine, the threat was always there, like a shadow that never completely disappears, even under the strongest light. Every time Aaron left to do his patrols, Lena felt her stomach tighten. Every time she heard footsteps outside, her heart raced. Every time voices echoed in the distance, both froze, looking at each other in silence, waiting. Waiting to see if they had been discovered. Waiting to see if that would be the end. Because the truth was simple and brutal. They were living in a powder keg. Each passing day was one more day of borrowed luck. Each approach between them carried real risk. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't dramatic exaggeration. It was literal. If someone discovered that Aaron was hiding a woman from the other side, he would be considered a traitor. And treason, in that place, had no trial, no appeal, no second chance. It was summary execution or life imprisonment, and sometimes prison was worse than death. And Lena? She didn't even know for sure what would happen to her. She would be interrogated, for sure, possibly tortured to extract information she didn't even have. And then, deportation, if she was lucky, or something much worse. And still, they continued. Aaron kept hiding her. Lena kept staying, and both kept allowing that connection to grow, even knowing that each inch of closeness was one more inch of danger. It was like trying to light a flame in the middle of a room full of gasoline. You know that a single spark can explode everything. You know that the rational, the sensible, the safe thing would be to extinguish everything immediately. But you don't extinguish it. Because that flame, however small it is, however fragile it seems, is the only source of light in a place too dark. And the idea of extinguishing it, of going back to complete darkness, seems worse than the risk of exploding. There was one specific day that made everything even more tense. Aaron came back from one of the patrols with his face more closed than normal. He entered, locked the door harder than necessary, and stood there, leaning against the wood, breathing deeply as if trying to calm himself down. Lena immediately noticed that something had happened. "What's wrong?" she asked, already feeling the anxiety rising in her throat. He didn't respond immediately. He ran his hand over his face, let out a heavy sigh, and then finally looked at her. "They're intensifying the patrols. They said there are rumors of an infiltration in the area." Lena's blood ran cold. "Do they know?" "Not yet, but they're looking, and if they keep looking, they'll find." The silence that followed was heavy as lead, because they both knew what that meant. It was no longer a question of if they would be discovered. It was a question of when. And the more time passed, the greater the chances. Lena felt fear squeeze her chest, not just fear for her own safety, but fear for what would happen to Aaron. Because she was beginning to understand the size of the risk he was taking for her. He had thrown away years of discipline, of obedience, of a structured and safe life, had put everything at risk, career, freedom, life, for a woman he barely knew. And guilt began to settle in her like a dead weight. "You should turn me in," she said, her voice coming out firmer than expected. "Before it's too late. Before you lose everything because of me." Aaron looked at her as if she had said the most absurd thing in the world. "No. Aaron, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He cut her off, and there was an intensity in his voice she had never heard before. "I know exactly what I'm risking, and it doesn't change anything." "How doesn't it change? You're going to lose everything. And you think turning you in now will change that?" He took a step toward her, his eyes fixed on hers. "You think if I turn you in now, everything will go back to normal? That I'll simply forget you were here? That I'll be able to sleep at night knowing what they did to you?" His voice was louder now, loaded with an emotion he normally kept locked away. "I already made my choice. The moment I decided to hide you, I had already lost everything. The only difference is that now I know what I'm losing for." And in that moment, Lena understood that it wasn't about rationality. It wasn't about weighing risks and benefits. It wasn't about doing the right thing or the safe thing. It was about humanity. It was about looking at someone who needs help and not being able to turn your back, even knowing that helping can destroy you. It was about choosing the guilt of doing something wrong instead of the guilt of doing nothing. And she didn't know if that made her feel better or worse. Because now she had to carry the weight of knowing he was sacrificing himself for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The following days were even more tense. The patrols passed closer. The voices were more frequent. Aaron had to go out more times, stay out longer so as not to raise suspicion. And every time he left, Lena stayed there, alone in that silent space, counting the minutes, imagining terrible scenarios, mentally preparing for the possibility that he wouldn't come back, or that he would come back accompanied, or that he would come back only to say it was over, that they needed to run, that there was no more time. And every time she heard the door opening and saw his face, tired, tense, but alive, she felt a relief so great it almost hurt. And then there was the night they almost lost everything. Aaron had just returned from a patrol when they heard voices outside. Not distant voices, but close voices. Very close. And one of them asked, "Did you check this structure?" Lena and Aaron exchanged a look of pure terror. He made a quick gesture for her to hide, and she obeyed immediately, squeezing herself into a dark corner behind some old boxes, trying to control her breathing, trying not to make any sound. Aaron went out, closing the door behind him, and she heard his voice. Calm, controlled, totally different from the tension he had shown seconds before. "I already checked. It's empty. It always is." "Are you sure? Because we have strict orders to search everything." The other man's voice was suspicious. Lena held her breath. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure they could hear it. "You can search if you want," Aaron responded, and Lena almost had an attack. What was he doing? Why was he offering that? But then she heard another voice, a third person. "Forget it. If Aaron says he already checked, then he already checked. He never fails." There was a pause, a silence that seemed to last an eternity. And then, "All right, let's move on." The voices moved away. The footsteps disappeared in the distance. And only then did Lena allow the air to leave her lungs. When Aaron came back inside, she was trembling. Not from cold, but from pure retrospective fear. He approached, and for the first time since they met, he touched her deliberately, placed his hands on her shoulders, firm, comforting. "It's okay," he said quietly. "They're gone." "Barely," she whispered, her voice failing. "Very barely." "I know." And in that moment, with his hands still on her shoulders, with their faces so close she could feel his breath, something changed irreversibly. Because almost losing something, almost losing someone, has a way of exposing what you really feel, has a way of burning down all the defenses, all the excuses, all the rationalizations you had been building. And when you look at that person and realize that the idea of losing them destroys you inside, you can no longer pretend, can no longer deny, can no longer hide behind, "It's just forced coexistence," or "It's just gratitude," or "It's just circumstance." And that was exactly what happened that night. Lena looked at Aaron, at that man who had risked literally everything for her, who had lied for her, who had put his own life on the line for her, and knew, with a frightening clarity, that she had fallen in love with him. Not in the slow and gradual way she always imagined love would happen, but in an abrupt, violent, undeniable way, like a collision, like that whirlwind that had ripped her from the sky and thrown her there. And when she saw in his eyes the same recognition, the same fear, the same feeling reflected back, she knew he also knew, that he also felt, and that now there was no going back. They had crossed the line, and all that remained was to discover if they could survive what came next. Things couldn't continue like this forever. They both knew that. It was like living on a tightrope. You can balance for a while. It might even seem like everything is under control. But sooner or later, the wind changes, the rope swings, and you need to decide, jump to safety or keep crossing, knowing each step could be the last. And for Lena and Aaron, that moment of decision was coming faster than either of them wanted to admit. Because the noose was tightening. The patrols had doubled. The questions were getting more direct. And luck, that fragile luck that had protected them until then, was running out. It was on a gray morning, with the sky heavy with clouds promising a storm, that everything began to crumble. Aaron returned from a mandatory meeting with his superiors, and his face said everything before he even opened his mouth. He entered, locked the door, and stood there for a long moment, just looking at the floor, as if gathering courage to speak. Lena felt her stomach sink. What happened? He took a deep breath, ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she had learned to recognize, and finally looked at her. They know someone is here. They don't know who. They don't know where. But they know. And they're going to do a complete sweep of the entire area, house by house, structure by structure. They start tomorrow morning. Lena's world stopped. Tomorrow morning. That meant they had less than 24 hours, less than a day to decide what to do, to find a solution, to discover an exit that probably didn't exist. Then we need to run, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to think fast. Tonight, we leave, cross the border, find a way to... It's not that simple, Aaron interrupted her, and there was an exhaustion in his voice she had never heard before. The border is being watched. There are cameras, sensors, patrols every 500 meters. Any suspicious movement triggers alarms. And even if we managed to get through, where would we go? You would be arrested on the other side for illegal invasion. I would be hunted as a deserter. He let out a bitter laugh, without humor. There's no clean exit. There never was. Lena felt tears burn in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent too much time being strong, holding in emotions, pretending everything was okay. But now, facing the raw and inevitable reality, it was becoming impossible to maintain the facade. So what do we do? Her voice came out lower, more fragile than intended. Do we give up? Do we just accept? Aaron didn't respond, and his silence was more terrifying than any words could have been. Because Lena realized, in that instant, that he was already considering the only option that remained. The option that both had avoided mentioning, but that had always been there, hovering over them like a guillotine waiting to fall. You want to turn me in? She said. And it wasn't a question, it was a statement. Aaron closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was a pain there that cut Lena in half. I don't want to, but it might be the only way to keep you alive. Alive? She repeated, her voice rising involuntarily. You think turning me in will keep me alive? You know what they'll do to me. I know, he said, and his voice was hoarse, loaded with an emotion he could no longer hide. But if they find you on their own, it will be worse. Much worse. At least if I turn you in, I can negotiate. I can say I just found out, that I was investigating, that I was going to report anyway. I can try to soften the consequences. Lena looked at him as if he were a stranger, as if everything they had built over the past weeks was an illusion that was unraveling before her eyes. Soften? Do you really believe that? Or are you just trying to convince yourself you're doing the right thing so you can sleep at night after? The sentence came out harsher than she intended, more cruel, more fierce. But she was angry. Angry at him for considering that. Angry at herself for having allowed herself to trust. Angry at the entire world for putting them in that impossible situation. Aaron didn't retort, didn't defend himself, just looked at her with those tired, defeated eyes and said, If you have a better idea, I'm listening. And Lena realized she didn't have a better idea, didn't have a miraculous plan, didn't have a magic solution that would solve everything. All she had was fear, anger, and an overwhelming feeling of helplessness. She sat on the floor, rested her head in her hands, and for the first time since she had fallen in that cursed place, she let the tears fall. They weren't silent and dignified tears. They were desperate tears, accompanied by sobs she couldn't control. And Aaron, that man of stone who rarely showed emotion, knelt beside her and pulled her into a hug. He didn't say anything, didn't try to console with empty words, just held her while she fell apart. And there, in that tight embrace, with both of them on the floor of an abandoned structure that had become their entire world, something crystallized. Because Lena realized she didn't want to die without having said it. Didn't want everything to end with regrets, with things unsaid, with feelings kept out of fear or pride or circumstance. So she pulled away enough to look at his face, with red eyes and a face wet with tears, and said, "I love you." The words came out simple, raw, without adornments. I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other. I know it doesn't make any sense. But I love you, and if everything is going to end anyway, I needed you to know. Aaron looked at her, as if she had just rewritten all the rules of the universe, as if those 3 words had more power than any law, any border, any threat. And then, for the first time since they met, he let the armor fall completely. "I love you too," he said, his voice coming out low but firm, each word loaded with truth. "Since the moment I saw you fallen in that field and decided not to make the call. I already knew. I just didn't want to admit it because admitting would make everything harder. But it's true. I love you. And I don't know how this is possible, but it's real." And there, in that moment where everything was crumbling, where there was no guaranteed future, where each second could be the last, they kissed. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't perfect. It was desperate, urgent, full of fear and desire, and all the repressed emotion that had accumulated over weeks. It was the kind of kiss that says, "I don't know what comes next, but in this moment now, you are all that matters." And when they finally separated, both breathless, with their foreheads touching, the world was still crumbling around them. But at least now, they weren't alone in the collapse. There comes a moment when the heart becomes louder than logic. A moment when all the sensible reasons not to do something, all the obvious consequences, all the rational arguments, simply cease to matter. Because there are things that are bigger than survival. There are things that are bigger than safety. And pretending you're not listening to your heart, pretending you can ignore what you feel, becomes a form of cowardice, becomes a form of already being dead inside. And both Lena and Aaron had spent too much time living safe but empty lives. Too much time obeying rules that didn't make sense. Too much time surviving instead of living. And maybe that's why, even with everything crumbling, even knowing the chances were almost zero, they made a different choice. Not the safe choice, not the logical choice, but the courageous choice. Aaron looked at Lena and said, "We're not going to turn ourselves in, and we're not going to wait to be captured. We're going to try. I don't know if it will work, probably won't, but we're going to try to escape. Together." And Lena, with red eyes but with renewed determination, nodded. Together. Because sometimes you need to choose between living safely or truly living. Between protecting the body but killing the spirit, or risking everything for a chance, even if tiny, to have something real. And they had chosen risk, had chosen each other, had chosen courage over fear. And even if everything went wrong, even if they were captured, even if everything ended in tragedy, at least they would have tried. At least they would have fought. At least they wouldn't have lived the rest of their lives, however short, wondering, what if? And there was a strange freedom in that, a peace amid chaos. Because when you finally stop running from what you feel, when you finally accept love for what it is, dangerous, reckless, magnificent, you discover that fear loses some of its power. It doesn't disappear, but it gets smaller, it becomes bearable. And you discover you're capable of much more courage than you imagined. And it was with that fragile but real courage that they began to plan. They had one night. A single night to map a route, gather supplies, wait for the right moment. One night to prepare for what could be the last time they would be in that place that, strangely and improbably, had become home. One night to memorize each other's faces, intertwined hands, the sound of shared breathing. Because if everything went wrong, and there were great chances it would, at least they would have had that. That piece of time where they were completely honest, completely vulnerable, completely alive. What happened after that night is a story we may never fully know, because some stories don't have clear endings, neatly arranged, wrapped with a bow. Some stories end in question marks, in possibilities, in mysteries you carry forever. What we know is that Lena and Aaron tried. We know they left that structure in the middle of the night, with hearts beating so hard they seemed ready to jump out of their chests, with hands intertwined as if it were the only thing keeping them anchored to reality. We know they took absurd risks, crossed dangerous territories, trusted each other in a way that's only possible when you have nothing left to lose. Some say they managed to cross the border, that they found a blind spot in the patrols, a moment of carelessness in the sensors, a tiny window of opportunity they seized with the courage of the desperate. Some say they were seen months later in a small town far from there, living under false names, rebuilding lives from scratch, carrying scars but also carrying each other. Some say Lena eventually returned home, but was never the same, that there was a depth in her eyes that hadn't existed before, a quiet sadness mixed with something that looked like gratitude for having lived something real, even if brief. And some say they didn't make it, that they were captured before reaching the border, that they paid the price for courage, for love, for the audacity of believing they could rewrite the rules. But even in that version, some swear they were seen holding hands until the last moment, that even when everything collapsed, they didn't let go. Because some things, once you choose them, you carry until the end. And love, true love, the kind that changes you inside, is one of those things. The truth? The truth is, it doesn't matter which version you choose to believe. Because what this story really tells isn't about happy or tragic endings. It's about what happens when life rips you from the safe place and throws you into unknown territory. It's about what happens when you meet someone you shouldn't meet, at a moment that shouldn't happen, and yet it happens. It's about courage, about humanity, about the choice to extend your hand when it would be easier to turn your back. It's about discovering you're capable of much more love and much more courage than you ever imagined. Because their love wasn't about perfect destiny. It wasn't about soulmates that were made for each other since the beginning of time. It was about two completely different people, from opposite worlds, who met by accident and decided, consciously, courageously, to choose each other, even knowing that choice could cost everything. And there's a devastating beauty in that. There's a truth that cuts deep. Because in the end, none of us know how much time we have. None of us have a guarantee of a happy ending. All we have are moments, and the choice of how to live those moments. If we're going to live with fear, protecting our hearts behind high walls, or if we're going to truly live, risking, feeling, loving, even knowing it might hurt. Sometimes life throws you in directions that scare you, pushes you to places you never planned to go, puts you before choices you never imagined having to make. And in those shocks, in those violent impacts that completely knock you off your axis, you discover who you really are. Discover what you're capable of. Discover that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Discover that love isn't just the soft and comfortable feeling that warms you on cold nights, but also the dangerous flame that can burn everything around, including you, and is still worth feeding. Lena learned that worth doesn't come from external achievements, but from being honest with herself. From listening to her own voice instead of living chasing the approval of someone who will never be fully satisfied. She learned that sometimes life breaks you completely, just to teach you to rebuild yourself the right way. Not the way others expect, but the way you need. And Aaron learned that rules aren't more important than people. That blind obedience isn't virtue, but abdication. That living within straight and safe lines can keep you alive, but doesn't make life worth living. He learned that humanity is the courage to disobey when obedience becomes cruelty. And maybe that's what makes unlikely encounters so remarkable. They don't happen on safe ground. Don't come with instruction manuals or guarantees that everything will work out. They catch you by surprise, mess you up completely, and force you to choose between the person you were and the person you could become. And the most courageous, most alive, most true versions of ourselves only appear when we're facing the unknown. When we don't have the script ready. When we need to improvise, risk, trust instinct instead of trusting the map. Because in the end, life isn't about avoiding collisions. It's about what you do when they happen. It's about how you get up after impact. It's about whether you choose to close yourself off, build even higher walls, swear never to risk again, or if you choose to continue with an open and exposed heart, knowing you can be hurt again, but preferring to feel rather than stay numb. It's about understanding that safety isn't the same as being alive, that protection isn't the same as freedom, that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is love without guarantees. And if you're listening to this story and feeling something stir inside you, a memory, a longing, a regret, a hope, maybe it's because you've also been ripped from the root. Maybe you've also met someone you shouldn't have. Maybe you've also faced an impossible choice between safe and true. Or maybe you're still waiting for the courage to extend your hand, waiting for the right moment that may never come. And if that's the case, let me tell you something. The right moment rarely exists. What exists is the moment when you decide that the pain of not trying is worse than the pain of trying and failing. The story of Lena and Aaron is a story about forbidden love, about impossible borders, about courage in the face of chaos. But it's also a story about you, about me, about all of us who have found ourselves before something we knew was risky, but couldn't let pass. It's about the part of us that refuses to live a small, safe, predictable life. The part that prefers to feel, even if feeling hurts, than to live anesthetized. The part that knows, deep down, that a life without risk is also a life without color, without texture, without those moments that make everything worthwhile. So maybe the question isn't, did they make it? Maybe the question is, did they live? And the answer is yes. Yes, they lived. More intensely in those few weeks than many people live in entire decades. They truly loved, truly risked, truly chose. And regardless of the ending, happy, tragic, or somewhere in between, they had something most people spend their entire lives looking for: a moment of absolute courage. A moment where the heart spoke louder than fear. A moment where love was greater than all the logical reasons not to love. And maybe, in the end, that's what life is made of. Not the years we live, but the moments that really matter. The moments where we were courageous, where we were true, where we chose heart over head and didn't regret it, even when it hurt. Because pain passes, fear passes, but regret stays. The feeling of, what if I had tried, is a weight you carry forever. And it's a weight much heavier than any consequence of having tried and failed. So if this story touched something in you, if it made you remember something you kept deep in your chest, if it made you feel that tightness in your heart that comes when you recognize a truth you tried to ignore, don't ignore it. Don't let it pass. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Because life is made of collisions, of unexpected encounters, of moments that knock you off course and throw you in directions you never planned. And in those moments, all you can do is decide. Are you going to close yourself off, protect yourself, go back to safety? Or are you going to extend your hand, risk your heart, and see what happens when you finally stop being afraid to truly live? The answer is yours. It always was. It always will be. If this story spoke to you in some way, if it made you remember something you kept deep in your chest, if it made you feel that tightness in your heart that comes when you recognize a truth you tried to ignore, or if it simply kept you company for a few minutes on a difficult day, leave that like on the video. It helps other people find these stories, and helps me continue bringing narratives that touch where life really happens. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe and turn on the bell. Because here at Ctrl plus Love, every week there's a new story. Stories about love that arrives without warning, about courage amid chaos, about people who chose to feel, even when it was easier to protect themselves. And comment below, have you ever lived something that completely knocked you off course? Ever met someone you shouldn't have, but who changed everything? Ever had to choose between safe and true? I read all the comments, and sometimes the most incredible stories come from you. Who knows, your story might become the next episode. Because in the end, we're not alone in these collisions. We just need the courage to admit they happened, and that they mattered, and that they were worth it, even when they hurt. Thank you for staying until here. Thank you for feeling with me. And remember, life is made of collisions. The question isn't if they'll happen. The question is what you'll do when they happen. If you'll close yourself off, or if you'll extend your hand. The choice has always been yours, and always will be. Until the next story, until the next encounter, until the next time we allow ourselves to truly feel. Ctrl plus Love, stories that feel like love.